Thank you so much. Thank you. Still love hugs, dear. Thank you so much for that interesting and comprehensive introduction. It's always intimidating when you hear somebody, read your bio. And the typical question I get then is, how old am I? I'm old enough. So as you aptly put it, my name is Palesa Ntoagae, and I have the incredible privilege and honor of leading the HR agenda at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I still pinch myself most days because I grew up, not even knowing anything about that world, and here I am. I'd really love to thank the generous sponsors for curating this event and for everybody for choosing to spend their time with us this morning. And if I may begin and say simply, all protocol observed. So it was December 2020 when Michael Sudgen published a quite humorous article about the 10 COVID phrases that should be binned, and suggested that, after listing them, that the year simply needs to be written off because it was an annus horribilis. Unfortunately, and unbeknown at the time, we didn't realize that 2021 would be a continuation of that. And we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. But to kickstart the conversation, I want to start with highlighting perhaps 3 of many shifts that disrupted the workplace, which results with our leaders and HR officers facing significant complexity in the workplace. The first one was the real and emerging rise of employee resilience as a competitive advantage. If you look at the Global Risks Report that was published earlier this year, they cited that social cohesion erosion, livelihood crises, and mental health deterioration were the 3 risks that deteriorated the most globally. And internally, we have seen how our staff members have grappled with mental health issues that have manifested in the workplace. In fact, our medical health report shows us that over the last 2 years, depression rose over 200% just from our own internal staff members. And so when you think about how, until now, companies spent a lot of time highlighting the monetary aspects as a compelling employee value proposition, but I would argue that it's those employers who are focusing on mental health and other soft, intangible benefits that are going to set them different from other employers. So those soft, fluffy things that, were usually always forgotten have really become the new hard measures that matter for staff when they choose potential employers. Externally, we've also seen how issues that really put us in the headlines for the wrong things nationally, such as gender-based violence, have forced us to think differently about what we want to advocate for, because we saw how some of our staff members had to deal with that scourge in their own homes. So the way companies responded over the last 2 years has really differentiated the ones who are the great employers versus those who are actually have a say-do disconnect, as my previous mentor and leader often coins it. The second piece is the dispersion of workforce. Work has become fluid, and I think the last 2 years actually forced a lot of corporates to accept that it's what we do, not necessarily where we go, and naturally, industries differ, right? But this digital inequality has really also separated and left behind those who are still peddling and struggling with the disruption that's been caused in a normal structure and an organization. And can you imagine those leaders who struggle with proximity bias? They have by far are still actually struggling with what does actually productivity mean? Is it me seeing somebody work or actually understanding how do I measure the outcomes of what people do? And so this constant challenge for emerging work models that are emerging is something that we were not ready for. We recently approved a hybrid work policy, and so our staff members are able to work from home or the office, depending on the day that they're having. But the interesting thing lately, I keep getting questions about, what about a distributed workforce model? And so you can see that the employee has a voice. They are asking questions because we've been able to appreciate that there are certain tasks that actually can be done away from the office. But the real battle for us is, how do we preserve that culture, the smell of the place that set us through hard times, as the JSE? So the pandemic has really fast-tracked that in some respects, and the organizations need to think differently about having an open-minded approach to ensure that we digitally enable our staff to be able to thrive and continue to work. The last point, and my personal favorite, is managing 5 generations in the workplace. There's a lot of research on generational theory, and whether you are in the school of thought that suggests that people born in a certain era have certain preferences, and therefore we can reasonably predict what they want in a place of work, or the era that says it's actually about individual preferences. Either way, the reality is the leader in this day and age has to deal with people with different perspectives. My son, Jabari, he's 15 years old. He attends a school that has gender-neutral bathrooms. He has a friend that has 2 fathers, and he makes his money from trading online. He spends most of his time building designs for games, and he connects and collaborates with 3 friends who are based in San Francisco, in Hong Kong, and in Poland. So our biggest battles on weekends is what time he goes to bed, because there's a time zone issue. When I was 15, all I cared about was playing netball. And I tried so hard to get good marks so my parents could buy me a Nokia 3210 headset. That's who I was. We're now having conversation about the metaverse. So I put it to you that you can only imagine the type of complexity that a leader is faced with today as a different generation enters the workforce with different expectations. It really presents us with a different and interesting dynamic on the plate that's already full from a DEIB perspective. DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So while preparing for this morning's conversation, I did a lot of research just to say, what is the common understanding then, so that if we can kind of lift our heads from that base, then we're all on the same page, right? Else I'm just having a conversation by myself. And so what I loved is the definitions that are presented on the screen, because they are wholesome. They are wholesome, and they do such a simple way of defining digital era, digital transformation, digital economy, because that is the power that businesses have to really catapult and inject the economy. A lot of what Ntate Bonang said is actually quite relevant. It is the leaders in this room, it is the leaders in your businesses that are the ones who will be able to take the shifts that technology allows us to do in order to shift the business and ensure that we are able to repurpose and ensure that people maintain skills or are building skills that will set them relevant for the next course. And so it is from this position that I want to start and really digging deep into the conversation about the skills required of a digital leader in this era. And I'd like to also offer a view and say, let's deconstruct the topic. Because in my mind, there are traits that will stand us through the course of time, but it's about what are those behaviors that we need to exude in this era that is presented with all the speed of information to ensure that we simply do a better job of taking everybody along as we reimagine the organizations for what they could be. And so I'm going to ask a series of reflective questions because at our exco, that's typically how we work. We're very clear on how do we answer the problem the other way around by saying what problem are we trying to solve for. And if leadership is a driving factor in the success of business, particularly in this era, we need people who are both reactive and proactive and focusing on generating value. A great transformational leader understands that while technology is the catapult, it's just as important to take people along. You cannot do it alone. And so please hear me out as I share the bucket of skills or competencies that in my mind may be useful for us to consider and ensure that we are reskilling our leaders in the organization accordingly. The first question, are you a neophiliac? And it is not a health condition, but it is rather a mindset. It's a mindset that is characterized by an innate curiosity. It is a mindset that answers questions about why things are done that way. It is a mindset that has the ability to connect things that are seemingly unrelated, but actually, if you study the patterns, are held together by a golden thread. Successful leaders will be able to make those changes and inspire others to follow because they believe and they have the conviction that this is the direction with which we need to go. Have you ever often heard of the statement that, it's the crazy people that kind of reinvented amazing technologies? It's because it is. You will sound like you are losing your mind, but actually you are way ahead of the pack. And being comfortable with making decisions with incomplete information is something that we all need to start getting comfortable with. The second, what is your digital dexterity? So your natural interests to just experiment, test, adopt, try and figure things out, because that is how people that are curious about technology often discover. The ones that in the place of work, we're currently testing a mental well-being app, and I can see immediately, I call them my friends of HR, who are very quick to say, I've downloaded the app, Palesa. They're not waiting for training, they've done it. So in what way are you or your leaders executing this trait in your day-to-day lives? Or are you still limited by your risk appetite because of a learning moment you had early in your career? Third, what is the diversity of your network and your teams? Because leaders embrace and surround themselves with people who are different to them. We are not looking for echo chambers. We are looking for somebody who's going to say, I don't agree because of X, Y, and Z. Because it's those views that represent the different stakeholder groups in your team, in your business, and guess what? In society. That actually is what gives you the competitive advantage. Need I remind us of the H&M monkey sweater? 4, are you a servant leader? Because servant leaders understand that positional power in this continent, specifically Africa, if you look at Hoofstede's 6 dimensions, it's a big factor on our continent. Your title matters, your title carries weight. And if you are tuned into saying, how do I serve or remove stumbling blocks for my staff? Those are the things that will make people want to speak to you, even when things go wrong. And great leaders in this era understand that they have the power to create holding spaces for teams to thrive. The adversity quotient that was introduced by Paul Stoltz back in 1997 is a good understanding that you have to be able to create a space that allows your teams to have that resilience and capacity to cope with constant change. And I would argue that in this era, we keep measuring EQ, IQ. We really need to start measuring that quotient for the leaders that we bring into our businesses. And lastly, is your mic on or are you on mute and listening to what's in it for me? because there is no prosperity for any of us if we are only concerned about self. And some of the implications of the challenges that we've been solving for is there are clear organizational capabilities that rest with the line manager that are important for us to master. Your ability to connect with people, to communicate, because everybody's everywhere, has become that much more important. And we know the benefits of honing in on organizational connections, because when people thrive, solutions to challenging problems are actually resolved very quickly. You know, they influence the quality of decision making and the extent to which you can drive that collaboration in a purposeful way will really set you apart from those who aren't. And I think typically in the past, it's been acceptable for leaders to kind of have a distant role, you know, and if there's issues, then people are always knocking on the HR door. But I would argue that you are now the first line respondents in this era. So turning the question around, and I'm going to connect back to some of the points that Ntate Bonang referenced. The reality is we have to think about what is the real challenge actually for us. And I'd like to offer in a question form that how are you and how are your leaders using your talents, your decision rights, your mandates, your business, fueling it with technology to develop solutions that are scalable for a broader impact so that we leave no one behind. Because we know that the pandemic has resulted in massive job losses. And I think while people like to reference Uber and Facebook, I said this point earlier at Algoa FM, it's actually the leaders that are the ones who thought, how do I disrupt but also create other different job opportunities? Bring it closer. Whether you're a fan or not, the advent of your grocery delivery service has actually repurposed people who would have otherwise been sitting with a begging bowl on the robots. That's actually the power behind the technology, colleagues. 5 minutes. I'm done. Secondly, the African demographic dividend. So I love that phrase. It's coined by the African Union Commission. We have a scary unemployment rate. And the figure that's quoted, I would argue, actually on the ground is higher. Yet Africa has the world's youngest workforce. And so how are we ensuring that as we use technology to reinvent our businesses, that we are honing in on creating employment opportunities so that we can really reap this African dividend, because it's there. Third, the Global Elderman Trust Barometer that Ntate Bonang referenced, it really is a scary and real realization that the CEOs in this room and business are the ones that are carrying hope for society. Where government fails, we have to step in. We can't be on the armchair critic anymore. In fact, there's nothing that bores me more when somebody wants to start having a go, you know, talking about what government is doing. What are we doing? And that is the real measure. And so I bring it back to you. How are you using your talents, knowing what you know, to ensure that technology is used to disrupt, but create opportunities so that we leave no one behind? Share the 5 traits. There's certainly more. That is the world of, you know, work experience, academia, research. But I think the real issue we are trying to solving for colleagues is to ensure that we rebuild and ensure that economic and society is included in the era of the next. I thank you.